For this exercise, you're going to be creating a variety of different compositions from a set of photographs of different hands. These compositions are going to be done in Photoshop, and we're going to learn some different layering, masking, and adjustment techniques that are going to give you this result. To get started, you need to download the Hand Compositions Exercise folder, and inside of this folder I'm giving you a variety of different kinds of hands. Some of them are in color, some of them are in black and white, and you can pick and choose from these whichever that you want. Now at the end of this, you're going to be creating 5 different compositions. So as we set this up, what we do for one of them, you're essentially going to do for all of the different final compositions. The first thing we need to do is to fire up Photoshop, and let's create a new Photoshop document from scratch. We'll go to File and create a new document. The size of this document needs to be 10 inches wide by 15 inches tall. Do make sure you're working in the inches proportions. Also, we'll keep it at a high resolution of 300 pixels per inch. And as far as the color mode goes, everything that we want to do initially is going to be done in grayscale. Typically we work in RGB or CMYK, but turning this on will automatically take any photograph and get rid of the color. Also, as you create each of your compositions, let your background content either be black or white, and you can play around with the look and feel of each one of these. Depending on the type of layer masking or layer mode you're working on, it's going to give you some different results. I'm going to start off this composition by just choosing black as my background color. Everything else will remain the same, so when I say create, this will give us our blank document to start from. Now let's place some of our hands into our composition. I'm going to drag this to the side so I can see my hands to work with. There's 2 different ways you can place your hands. Of course, you can take an image and drag it into here, or you can go up to File, and I like to use Place Embedded. And then from here you can pick and choose the hands that you want to work with. Whenever it's placed, do make sure you hit Return to lock in your placement. And before I place another one, let me pull my layers up here. I've got my hand in one layer. We need to add on a levels adjustment. So inside of your adjustment panel, add a levels adjustment on top of it, and then I'm going to group both of these into a folder. So select both of the layers, choose your little folder icon, and I'm simply going to rename it Hand 1 to keep it separate from there. So inside each of the folders is going to have a levels adjustment, and you'll see why in just a moment, and also the hand that you're working from. Let's continue on and place at least 2 more hands for my composition. So I'll drag this one onto here, hit Return, and then go to Adjustments and place a levels adjustment on top of there. Select both of them and put them into a folder. And finally, let's do another one. Place a levels adjustment, select both of them, and put them inside of a folder. This will be Hand 3. Next, we need to mask off all of our hands so that we only see the hand and none of the background that's behind it. I'm going to recommend that you take this one layer at a time. So in my layers, I'm going to turn off visibility for each of my hands, and I'm going to select the hand layer that I'm wanting to work on. So make sure that layer inside the folder is also selected. Now, there's a variety of different ways of doing this, and some will work better than others. The first thing we need to do is to select the hand that we're working on. To do that, I like to use my Quick Selection tool. With the Quick Selection tool, you can change the size of it and whether you're adding on or subtracting away from your selection. But when you click and drag, the computer is going to look for a natural edge between the light and the dark pixels. And in some cases it's going to go relatively quickly, but in other cases it may jump and quickly make a larger selection. So for instance, you can see how it's picking up the black pixels simply because there's not a lot of difference between the fade and the arm. If this happens, simply hold down the Option key and click and drag to erase away, and try to select as much as you can just using this tool. Eventually, you'll reach a point where it's just too difficult to get the actual edge, and we'll need to make some further refinements. So from here, I'm going to say this is pretty good, even though I know I'm messing up, even though I know I'm messing up on my arm, and part of these fingers. In the Layers panel, to quickly add a layer mask, click on Add Layer Mask button at the very bottom center. This will mask it off and make your layer mask. And you can see how the sharp edges on this side don't look very good. A quick way to refine this would be to double-click on your layer mask and go into your layer mask refinement mode. Now, in order to work with these, have a look at your properties on the right-hand side. Set your view to be on layers so that you can see everything that's below it, and set your refinement mode to color aware. Later on, you can play around with the other refinement tools as well. Finally, down at the bottom, under your output settings, do make sure Output to Layer Mask is selected. Next, to make your refinement, I like to use the Refine Edge brush tool. That's the second tool in your toolbox. This works just like a brush, so you can change the size of it at the top. But when you click and drag over an edge, let's make my brush a little bit bigger, it'll start to look for the final edge along your area. And in this case, especially for something like the thumb, it does a great job of getting those in-between selections. So I'm going to click and drag around and further refine the look of my hand until it looks a lot more natural. All right, now that it looks really good here, we'll go back over to our Properties panel. Again, make sure Output to Layer Mask is selected, and when we say OK, this will update your layer mask and give you a much more natural selected hand. Now, sometimes this doesn't work for everything. I'm going to choose this third hand. Again, make sure your hand is selected. Use your Quick Selection tool to quickly and easily select just the hand itself as best as you can. Again, on the thumb, it's not going to get 100% of everything, but with it selected, I can still choose my Add Layer Mask to mask it off. I'm going to turn off my background hand too. Now, if I double click on this hand, this will again go into my layer refinement, and I can click and drag and get most of the parts of the hand, but when I try to do something like the thumb, it's not going to give me a very good looking selection. In this case, it's not going to work out very well just to use this tool. So to further refine this, I'll do the best I can with what I've got. We'll say OK. This is where using your paintbrush tool is going to come in handy. With the paintbrush tool, if you have your fill color or your foreground color set to white, wherever you paint white will unmask the area, which will give us a good selection. And if I swap over my fill color to black, it will unmask or erase away the area. So working between both of these with a good, I like to use a soft edge brush sometimes, is another way of making your selection and getting a better refinement. The main thing is, take some time to mask out and unmask different areas using either your brush or your Refine Edge tool until you get something that you like. Later on, you can always go back in and clean these up. The final thing I'll show you about masking off these hands, especially once it's already fully masked, is maybe you want to have it fade out on the arm. You can see how this arm kind of chops itself off here. In order to fade a hand, again, I'm going to select my layer mask. I'm going to use my gradient tool. Gradient tool is usually hiding underneath your paint bucket. With the gradient tool selected, set your foreground color to black and set your gradient type under Basics to be foreground to transparent. With a linear gradient selected, you can click and drag, and this will add a gradient of black to transparent on top of here that will allow you to quickly and easily fade out that hand. So that's a good tip to have in handy. Let's do the same for that first hand that I did. Again, make sure you've got the layer mask selected. I want to back out so I can see it. And if I want to fade out this hand, I'll simply click and drag, and it will fade that hand into there. And this will be a much quicker and easier way to make some of my transitions. So repeat this process for each of the different hands that you have, making the selection and masking them off, and then refining the mask until you get what you like. mask. Now that I've got all of my hands masked off, comes the fun part of actually making my composition. In order to do this, you can turn on each of the different layers so you can see it, and I'm going to set my Move tool to automatically select an entire group, not just an individual layer. I'm also going to turn on my Transform controls. This will make it easier to click on a hand and move it around, and also it gives me a bounding box in case I want to scale it or rotate it or resize it. And from here, we'll start to build out a different kind of composition. Now, I can see each of my selections and my hands because they have transparency already built into them. But to further refine this, we can play around with our blending modes. For instance, if I select just the folder and not the layer, do make sure you got the folder selected of this hand. Changing our blending mode from pass-through to something like screen or even overlay or difference will start to give me some different results. For instance, if I set it to screen, this will pick up all of my lighter pixels, and I can see it even when it's on top of the hands that are below it. If I set it to overlay or hard light, you can see how it's going to pick up different parts of that as well. If I set it to difference, that's even cool because it gives the opposite effect once it's on top of other layers too. So playing around with the look and feel of each one of these will give you some different results. Let's set each one of these to screen for now. That'll look good. And see if I can quickly build out a simple composition. Again, from here, I can play around with the blending mode. So difference gives me that, overlay or hard light. If I chose something like hard light, you can see how it's just barely showing up. Well, this is where your levels adjustment comes in handy. If I wanted to bring back some of the details that I see within this hand, choosing the levels adjustment for that hand, and then going over to the properties panel and adjusting the highlights and shadows from here will allow me to bring back more or less details. Since it's a levels, I can bring up the highlights, or I can play around with the midtones, and that'll give me a different look and feel for this particular layer. Let's do the same for some other layers. Choose the levels, play around with that until you get something that you like. And again, you can play around with the blending mode for the entire folder, but don't play around with the blending mode for the layer. Tell you what, let's set it back to be hard light, then choose the adjustments layer and mix the layer adjustment for that too. While I'm here, I can also play around with my layer masking for some of these layers as well. Let's say I didn't want to have certain parts show up. This is where I can choose my layer mask and then go back in with my paintbrush and paint either black or white in order to give me the effect that I need on this one. With this process done, let's save this as a JPEG. We'll go up to File, down to Save As, and we'll give it a hand. I'll call it Hand Comp 1. Do make sure your format is set to JPEG. This will get rid of all of your layers, but we'll say Save because we want to flatten this down to one solid object. And we'll keep our image quality quite high. Everything else will remain the same as we say OK. So that's one composition that I've created. Go through now and repeat this process to create 4 more compositions, 5 total. You can use some of the hands that are already on here, or you can rebuild it completely from scratch. Just don't think that you have to remake an entire new Photoshop document. Once you're finished, you should have 5 different black and white compositions. In the next part of this exercise, we're going to add color to your otherwise black and white photographs. For this next part of the exercise, we're going to add color to our photographs by using a photo filter. By now, you should have at least 5 different compositions, all black and white. And remember, you can swap up some of the compositions being black or white for their backgrounds. Just make sure that you've got this part finished before jumping in. The first thing we want to do is to open up your compositions in Photoshop. So to do this, I'm simply going to drag it into Photoshop, or you can go to File and open it. Now previously, we were working in grayscale color mode. To add color to this, we need to change our color mode first. So I'm going to go up to Image, down to Mode, and choose RGB Color. Now this won't automatically colorize it. This will allow you to add color to your composition. Next, we're going to use a Camera Raw filter. So go up to Filter, down to Camera Raw Filter, and this will open up the Camera Raw filter settings. Now if you're used to working in photography and using Camera Raw, this is going to look exactly the same. It's going to apply everything to our layer that we're working on. The first thing we want to do is go to Basic, and from Basic is where you can adjust things like the exposure, the highlights, the shadows, and the entire dynamic range of everything we're working on. Do make sure that everything is set to 0 and you can play around with it. What I'm wanting to see is a good range of whites to blacks throughout your entire composition. So if you overexpose it, it's getting too white, or underexpose it, may get too dark. But depending on how you've got your composition set up. Another thing I like to do is to bump my texture and clarity up as high as I can so I can see all the different details that are from here. But again, you don't want to lose too much details. Even dehaze sometimes will give you some nice results. So playing around with the highlights and shadows until you get something that you like. Then we'll close up Basic and go down to our color grading. Color grading is where we're going to add an overall set of colors to the highlights, midtones, and shadows that'll give it a colorized image. Since this is black and white, the results that we get are going to be very dramatic. I like to start off with either my midtones or my highlights, depending on the composition. So if I wanted to, I can choose my midtone. Let's pull it over to a warmer side. And you can see automatically it's going to start to add the colors to the midtones that I'm working on. From here, you can further adjust how saturated or unsaturated you want it to be. And if I go down to my highlights, let's add a little bit more. So instead of it being just 100% orange, maybe we'll get a little bit darker orange, and I can again adjust my saturation from here. I do still want to see some white highlights. Let's do our shadows a different color though. Since I've chosen a warm color for my highlights, for my shadows, I'm going to move this into maybe a bluer range. And again, adjust your composition until all of the dark areas now have this nice blue tinge to it. You can further refine it by playing around with your blending and balance between the two. So the more or less blended it is, or the less balanced, will give you some different results. What I'm wanting to see is a nice transition from one color to the other, and you can play around with the midtones and colors to achieve whatever results that you want as well. Sometimes you can get really funky with it. So now I've almost got a 3-tone system for this. My highlights are yellow, my midtones are purple, and my shadows are blue. Once you get some results that you like, simply hit OK. This will apply your filter to your layer. This is the last thing that we need to do to our exercise. So from here, we'll go up to File, and let's simply do a save to save up this JPEG. Repeat this process for each of the other 4 compositions that you created. And once you're finished, you can then upload all 5 of your compositions to the Moodle page.